This portion of Election Night is sponsored by General Motors, people building transportation to serve people. By Citicorp Traveler's Checks, travel the world with us. And by IBM, helping put information to work for people. Now from CBS News Election Headquarters in New York, here again is Walter Cronkite.
On this, the 49th time that the United States population has been to the presidential well, it has come up with Ronald Reagan as the next president of the United States, the oldest man ever to be elected to that job in his first term at 69 years old, and he breaks several other precedents as well. He will be the first former Union president to occupy the White House, the first former sports announcer, the first former actor, and the first divorced man ever to be elected to the presidency. He also happens to be the first former governor of California elected to that job. The first man who has run in his first term from California as a citizen of that state, and the first who was born in Illinois. It is a sweeping landslide for Governor Reagan tonight, a huge one, much bigger than anybody had even dared to predict. Even his most enthusiastic supporters did not think that it was going to look like this tonight. In the national vote now, with almost half the nation counted, 42% of it counted, he has 50% of the vote to 43% for Reagan, 6% for John Anderson, the independent. And it will be noted that Jimmy Carter has won so far just these 4 states and the District of Columbia: Georgia, West Virginia, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia. And all of those blue states are the ones won by Ronald Reagan tonight. That makes the total electoral count at this moment 279 for Ronald Reagan. 270 was all it took to win, and he gathered those in quite easily and neatly. Carter has just 35 electoral votes, and undoubtedly what he is hoping now is that he can at least beat Barry Goldwater's stunning defeat in 1964, when that Republican conservative went down to defeat by winning just 6 states but collected 52 electoral votes. Let's take a quick look now around at the Senate races in all of the regions of the country where we've had reports on them. It's very important the Republicans have a chance to take a majority of the Senate for the first time since the first Eisenhower administration back in the early 50s. Harry Reasoner, how about the East?
Well, whether the Republicans control the Senate may very well be decided on 4 close races in the East. Let's look first at the recap board, which shows that in Connecticut, Chris Dodd has won the seat for the retiring Abraham Rippikoff. That seat remains Democratic. In Maryland, Charles Mathias has retained his seat. That seat remains Republican. But the other 4 races that we have in the East are very, very close. In New Hampshire, Warren Redmond against John Durkin, the Democratic incumbent, is holding a narrow lead. In our tabulated vote of selected precincts, it's too close to call. In New York, in a 3-way race, the incumbent, Jacob Javits, is running a bad third, but the race with 60% of the race in, but Alphonse D'Amato and Elizabeth Holtzman are just too close to call yet. In Pennsylvania, a very tight race between Arlen Specter, the Republican, and Pete Flaherty, the Democrat. They're going after the Republican seat held by the retiring Richard Schweikert. And in Vermont, the Democratic incumbent, the first Democrat ever elected in Vermont since the Republican Party was organized, is running narrowly behind Stuart Ledbetter, the Republican. That, too, is too close to call with 50% of the vote in. Incidentally, one little note on a couple of abscam congressmen. Michael Myers, the man who was expelled from the House, the first House member to be expelled since 1861, was defeated today by an independent Thomas Faglietta. And Frank Thompson, a Democratic incumbent who goes on trial later, was defeated today by a Republican, Christopher Smith. Dan?
In the Midwest, where the Republicans have been taking no prisoners and have closed the gates of mercy in terms of the presidential campaign, much the same thing is happening in the Senate races. Let's go to the recap board. The picture is there for you to see. Now, a moderate Democrat, Alan Dixon, the Secretary of State in Illinois, won as a Democrat there. This is for the seat being vacated by Adlai Stevenson III. In Indiana, Quayle over By, a conservative Republican wins. In Iowa, Grassley over Culver, a conservative Republican wins. Dole holds his seat in Kansas. In Missouri, one of the 2 Senate seats still open in the Midwest, that is, when I say open, still undecided, veteran Democratic Senator Tom Eagleton As you can see, this is with 52% of the precincts reporting in Missouri. Keep in mind that some of those precincts may not be complete. 52% of the precincts reporting, that's how close that race looks. Eagleton by no means having an easy time of it. In North Dakota, Andrews, the Republican, to fill the seat being vacated by Republican Senator Milton Young, wins there. In Ohio, John Glenn, a moderate Democrat, winning there. In South Dakota, George McGovern going down to defeat. In Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, the other liberal Democratic senator whose race remains undecided. This is the way it looks in the tabulated vote. 24% of the precincts reporting in Wisconsin, and Nelson is locked in a very close race. The message out of this in the Midwest tonight is that old saw, don't eat at a place called Mau's, don't gamble with a man named Doc, and for the early 1980s, don't run as a liberal Democrat in the Midwest. Now for a look at the Senate races in Dixie, Bob Schieffer.
Dan, all across the South in the Senate races, the Republicans have already picked up one seat. They stand a chance to pick up another and conceivably could pick up a third. Let's take a look at the board. There you see in Alabama, Jeremiah Denton. He's the former prisoner of war, held 7 years in a North Vietnamese prisoner of war camp. He has beat Jim Folsom, the 31-year-old son of the former Democratic governor of that state, kissing Jim Folsom, the man they said that when he opened a bottle of whiskey, he threw away the cork because there'd be no further need for it. He may be going out for refreshments tonight because Denton has won. He will be the first Republican senator since Reconstruction in Alabama. And if memory serves, I believe he's the first Republican ever elected statewide in Alabama. In Arkansas, no surprise there. Dale Bumpers, the incumbent, returned to office with a big margin. He was not expected to have any trouble. In Florida, a hot race going on there. That's Paula Hawkins, the Republican, the anti-ERA, anti-abortion, but a woman with strong consumer leanings in a very tight race with Gunter, the Democrat. A very nasty primary. Gunter beat the incumbent Democrat Richard Stone there. They also running neck and neck. Moving right on down the line, in Georgia, Senator Herman Talmadge, who had so many personal problems, was denounced by the Senate, but went on to win a very tough Democratic primary, is holding a lead over Republican Matt Mattingly, but with 59% of the vote in, that race has not been called as yet by CBS News. In Kentucky, no real surprise, Senator Wendell Ford elected to a second term. He had no serious opposition, campaigned very hard, had a very well-financed campaign. In Louisiana, the man who had the easiest night of all, Russell Long, returned to the Senate. He was elected in a special primary election in September, so he didn't have to worry about anything tonight. Russell Long goes back to the Senate from Louisiana. In North Carolina, we've got a real cliffhanger going there. Morgan, the incumbent, the Democrat, getting a real challenge from John East, a man who spent $600,000 in the last 4 weeks of the campaign on television ads. They say that every viewer in South Carolina saw an average of 50 television spots about John East, a college professor. He also got a lot of help from the moral majority, we're told, in some parts of North Carolina. Moving on down, this was something of an upset in Oklahoma. State Senator Don Nichols has beaten Andy Coates, who was a quite popular former district attorney of Oklahoma City, we're told. Nichols, a very conservative Republican, so he is the second Republican to be elected from the South tonight. In South Carolina, one man who did not fall victim to the Reagan landslide, that's Fritz Hollings. He'll be returning to the Senate from South Carolina, and he won with a margin of about, or piled up a win of about 74%. Well, how are things in the West? Leslie Stahl.
Bob, first of all, on the presidential side, Ronald Reagan isn't just beating Jimmy Carter, he's submerging him. And with that being the case, a lot of these Senate races are just being overwhelmed by coattails. You just can't deny it. First, in the state of Arizona, where Mr. Arizona, Barry Goldwater, was supposed to have a tough challenge, we can see that with 2% of the vote in, he is slightly ahead. He was to have a challenge by Bill Schultz, a millionaire landlord. We will be watching that and be watching for Reagan coattails in that state. In Colorado, another case that was supposed to be very close and is, according to the CBS estimate, extremely tight. You can see that Mary Estelle Buchanan, the Republican, is slightly ahead of Gary Hart, who was perceived or painted by his opponent as a liberal in Washington, who came back to the state and tried to appear to be conservative. This may be another state where Reagan Reagan's just swamping in the presidential race may overwhelm Gary Hart. In Idaho, according to the CBS estimate, Stephen Sims, the conservative Republican congressman, is leading over the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Frank Church. Let me just tell you what the presidential numbers are. According to the CBS estimate, Ronald Reagan is beating Jimmy Carter in Idaho by 75-20. So if Frank Church wins in that race, that'll be quite an accomplishment. One of the big issues there, if you can believe it, is the Panama Canal. It's a burning issue in Idaho. Frank Church led the fight against for the Panama Canal treaties, despite the fact that 94% of the state was against the treaties. In Utah, CBS News is estimating that Jake Garn has won the state of Utah. That is really not because Ronald Reagan is popular, it's because Jake Garn is popular. He is as conservative as Ronald Reagan. He beat Dan Berman, former state Democratic Party chairman, executive, I think he was, executive director of the party there. Lastly, let's look at Washington State, where the polls have just closed. This is another big Democratic Senate chairman. He's Warren Magnuson, the Democrat chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, in a tight race against the Republican Attorney General Slade Gordon, with only 1% of the vote in. It's a very close race out there, and we may be up watching this race, Gary Hart race, and possibly even the Frank Church race late into the evening. And despite what Harry says, this may be the region that decides whether the Republicans overtake the Senate this year.
So I've been keeping tabs on these reports of all of yours, and I get it as 9 races with incumbent Democrats where Republicans are now leading, some of those without many returns in yet. 9 where they're leading. The Republicans have already taken 4 seats from the Democrats. It could be possible tonight that on the Reagan coattails and with this conservative tide across the country, 13 seats will be won by the Democrats, the largest in modern times in the Senate in a single race, turning the control of the United States Senate handily over to the Republicans. And furthermore, every one of those Republican senators is more conservative than the Democrats they are ousting, some considerably more conservative, some far to the right compared to where the Democrats they have driven out of office have been or are driving out of office if all of this turns out. Now, all of these races may not go the way they're indicated right now, but that's what would appear to be the situation at the moment. In the state of Missouri, we just had a gubernatorial call there. It was expected to be a close race in a rematch, a rematch there between Christopher Bond and the present governor, Joseph Teasdale. Teasdale ousted Bond a couple of years ago, and now Bond came back this year, and according to a CBS News estimate, has won the state house at Jefferson City for the Republicans. So we've got a Senate that looks like it could very well tonight go conservative and Republican by a very considerable margin. The first time either house of the Congress has been in Republican hands since 53, 54, on the heels of the Eisenhower victory in 1952. And in the gubernatorial races, there are also some switches that are possibly going to take place tonight in the 13 races there. In the House of Representatives, as we reported to you earlier, we now have refined our estimate somewhat in the House that the new House will have 250 Democrats, 184 Republicans, which represents a loss of around 25 to 28 seats. That estimate of ours isn't absolutely firm, give or take 7 seats, but it indicates an improvement on the conservative Republican side in the House of Representatives, although the Democrats, of course, with those figures, retain control. Bruce Morton has been looking at the comparison between the Reagan 1980 landslide and the 1972 one put together by Richard Nixon, his fellow Californian. Bruce, come in.
Walter, as you said, the last presidential massacre was in 1972, and the victim, of course, was George McGovern, a Senate loser tonight, who then got just 38% of the vote. We don't know yet what percentage President Carter will end up with, but at the moment it's not very different from McGovern's. Our exit poll shows him with just over 40% in a three-way race, of course. And our poll shows some other similarities to 1972. Then McGovern got just over 48% of the Union vote. Now Carter is doing only a little better. He has about half the Union vote. The two run about the same with Catholics and so on. Defections, in other words, among traditionally Democratic groups. In 1972, though, McGovern's defeat was not a disaster for the Democratic Party. Richard Nixon did not have, to use the old phrase, long coattails. Ronald Reagan's coattail size is still open to question, but certainly, as that regional whip around a couple of minutes showed, the Republicans are making serious Senate gains. As for the House, we asked people in our poll today how they voted for Congress. Those poll figures don't mean anything in terms of who'll win a particular district, but overall, a lot more people today said they were voting Republican for Congress than did 4 years ago. And they don't seem to be doing any more ticket splitting than they did 4 years ago. So what that suggests, as our House estimate suggests, is that the Republicans may make sizable gains in the Congress tonight. Walter?
Earlier this evening, Phil Jones in Washington talked with President Carter's campaign manager and former chief of staff at the White House, Hamilton Jordan.
The presidency of this country is a very difficult job. I don't want to talk tonight, which should be a night of victory for Governor Reagan. I don't want to make a lot of alibis or excuses, but it is a difficult job. We, I think, have made tough decisions. We have not sidestepped issues in the last 4 years. Some of those decisions were politically controversial. There have been things that have happened around the world, such as the OPEC price increases, which had a devastating effect on our economy here at home. And we have still tonight a tragic situation in Iran where 52 Americans are being held hostage. So a number of these things came together in the last few days of the campaign, and then the tide turned against us. We had an independent candidate running. If many of those people, if he had not been in the race, would have supported the president. So it's a confluence of political and substantive things, plus an effective campaign by Governor Reagan in addressing the issues in a way that appeal to the American people.
With the victory just barely in hand, but a sizable victory that it is, the Reagan campaign forces, and now the transition force becomes that, is already beginning to put back together some of the loose ends that came apart in the last part of the campaign. At least according to Reuters, William Casey, who is the Reagan campaign chief, is saying tonight that Richard Allen, the foreign affairs advisor to Reagan, who withdrew a week ago because of charges of financial impropriety when he was in the Nixon administration, has rejoined, as of tonight, the Reagan staff. Allen has been mentioned as possibly the national security advisor in the Reagan administration. That would be the job now held under Carter by Zbigniew Brzezinski. As we've been reporting throughout the evening, it is a Reagan landslide tonight. He has won 279 electoral votes, according to our CBS News estimate, as you see on our board there. And Jimmy Carter has won just 35 electoral votes so far. And all of those big western states are yet to be heard from, or a lot of them are. Bill Moyers has a few words to tell us about one-term presidents. Bill?
Walter, listening to Hamilton Jordan a minute ago, I was reminded of something Mr. Jordan said to the staff at the Democratic National Committee not long after Jimmy Carter had been elected in 1976. Said Hamilton Jordan, after one term as governor of Georgia, Jimmy couldn't have been reelected in Georgia for a second term. Maybe he'll wind up that way in 1980. Well, he has. And while his defeat says a lot about the way Jimmy Carter has run things, it also says a lot about the office itself. It's almost a cliche to point out these days that not since 1960 has a president completed 2 terms in the White House or left office with the affection and esteem of his countrymen. Kennedy, elected and assassinated. Johnson, elected and discredited. Nixon, elected and disgraced. Ford, appointed and defeated. Carter, elected and defeated. It's rare, in fact, that presidents actually do serve 2 terms, Walter. Just look at the period leading up to this century. Hayes, elected to the smell of scandal. Garfield, assassinated. Arthur denied his party's nomination. Cleveland defeated for re-election by Harrison with a minority of the popular vote. Harrison defeated for re-election by Cleveland. McKinley assassinated. Roosevelt splitting the Republican Party. In fact, 22 of our 39 presidents have been one-term presidents. The good old days were never as placid as we remember them, Walter, and the presidency is more a target of turbulence than an island of stability. We Americans seem to revere the presidency and despise the men who seek it. During the campaign, we compare them to the noblest models. We compare them to Jefferson's brilliance, to Lincoln's wisdom, to the two Roosevelts' energy and charisma, to Kennedy's charm. But once they're elected, we look at them as if they were wanted posters at the post office. Yesterday, Ronald Reagan joined hands with his supporters in California and sang, "God bless America." Better he had sang, "God help me." Walter?
Thank you, Bill. And here is another state for Reagan, one that even the Reagan people themselves had thought they might lose tonight. In the Pacific Northwest, Washington has gone for Ronald Reagan. And also in California, in the Senate race there, where Alan Cranston, a liberal Democratic senator, was one of those targeted by conservatives, he has won his race over Paul Gann, who was one of the authors of Proposition 13, the ceiling on property taxes in California. It set off such a wave of that across the country. Alan Cranston has won. He is the first of the liberal senators targeted by the conservatives who has won a race tonight. Others have lost. Birch Bayh in Indiana, John Culver in Iowa, and George McGovern in South Dakota. Ronald Reagan, as you know, is expected soon at his hotel out there in California to address his group, and we will be going there when the time comes, although they say it is still several minutes away. So at this moment, we have 47% of the national vote in and 50% for Reagan, 43% for Carter, but Reagan leading with a whopping 288 electoral votes to 35 for Carter. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News Election Headquarters.
Looking good together, looking good.
Wednesday, a brand new Dukes of Hazzard on a special night. Enos will be a hero if he can only save Daisy from big city kidnappers. Watch the special Dukes of Hazzard and see how Enos gets a new TV series all his own. Wednesday at 8, 7 Central and Mountain, followed by the hit movie Love at First Bite.
Tomorrow on CBS.
Attention all stations, this is Broadcast Control in New York. During this 7-minute period, please monitor the network as late-breaking events may warrant CBS News election coverage returning before 11:30 p.m. Repeating, please monitor the network during this 7-minute period as late-breaking events may warrant a return of Campaign 80 before 11:30 p.m. Thank you. This is Broadcast Control in New York.